It's amazing to me how something so many people experience can still be so hard to really understand. Like we're talking about something that's pretty universal, but there's still this kind of disconnect. You know what I mean? Menstrual discomfort.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's one of those things where, the experience is so individual and so varied that it can be really tough to communicate, even for people who go through it.
Right, exactly. And you sent over some research that I was looking at, and it's really fascinating. It seems like it's suggesting a completely new way to even think about this whole thing.
Oh, yeah, the stuff on using electrical muscle stimulation.
Yeah, yeah, that to like simulate menstrual cramps. It sounds super out there, like something out of a sci-fi movie.
I know, right? It's pretty wild, but also kind of brilliant when you think about it.
I know. So the paper you sent is called Electrical Muscle Stimulation to Develop and Implement Menstrual Simulator System.
Yeah, that's the one. It's by, let me see, Chihiro Asada, Kotori Tsutsumi, and Katsunari Sato.
Okay, so they're looking at this EMS-based menstrual simulator system. And, at first glance, it does sound a little I don't know, out there, right? But what are they really trying to do with this? Like, what's the big picture goal here?
So basically, they're trying to use technology to create a way for people to actually experience in a physical way what menstrual discomfort can feel like. And not just for people who, haven't experienced it firsthand, but even for people who have.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about like raising awareness among people who've never had periods,
Yeah.
but also about deepening understanding even for those who do.
Exactly. It's like, even if you experience menstrual cramps yourself, it can be really difficult to describe that feeling to someone else. And then, of course, if you've never felt it, it's even harder to imagine. So by creating a system that can actually simulate those sensations, the hope is that people can develop a much deeper level of empathy and understanding.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. It's like trying to describe a color to someone who's been blind their whole life. Right?
Yeah.
There's no real frame of reference.
Yeah, it's like that. And the researchers actually talk about this idea of overcoming these physical barriers to understanding. And I think that's really at the heart of what they're trying to do.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. And in the paper, they talk about virtual reality too, right?
Yes, that's sort of the eventual goal, a full-on VR system that really immerses you in the experience. But the focus of the paper, and what we'll be mostly talking about today, is really the EMS technology itself and the demonstration system they built using EMS.
Got it. So they see VR as the ultimate application, but they're starting with this more focused exploration of EMS.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So let's start with the problem they're trying to address. This whole issue of how difficult it is to really communicate the reality of menstrual discomfort.
Right. And I think anyone who's had a period or knows someone who has probably encountered this at some point, right? Partners, friends, family members. Sometimes it feels like they just don't get it.
Oh, totally. All the time. And the researchers talk about this in the paper too, right?
Yeah, they emphasize that men and some women do not completely understand menstrual symptoms. And it's not always about a lack of wanting to understand. It's a really difficult thing to grasp if you haven't experienced it yourself.
Right, because it's so subjective. What might feel like a mild annoyance to one person could be totally debilitating for someone else.
Yeah.
And even between women, the types and intensity of symptoms can be completely different.
Yeah, exactly. It's like trying to describe what a specific food tastes like or a particular smell. If the other person hasn't had that same sensory experience, it's really hard to convey.
Yeah, it's like trying to describe the ocean to someone who's never seen it, right? Like
Right.
you can use all the words in the world, but it's not the same as actually being there. And the researchers talk about overcoming these physical barriers to understanding, which is what makes this whole EMS approach so interesting.
Right. It's about trying to bridge that gap to create a shared experience, even if it's a simulated one.
And they connect this to like global well-being and stuff too, right?
Yeah. They actually explicitly link their work to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, specifically Goals 3 and 5.
Which are, sorry for my name.
Oh, sure. So Goal 3 is all about ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all ages. And Goal 5 is about achieving gender equality and empowering all women and girls.
Okay, yeah.
So their argument is that by fostering a deeper understanding of menstruation and challenging the negative perceptions that often surround it, this technology could actually contribute to achieving these broader goals. It's a pretty big claim, but it makes sense when you think about it.
No, totally. Like, imagine the impact it could have if, say, more people in workplaces or schools really understood what people who menstruate are dealing with.
Exactly. It could lead to more supportive policies, more understanding from colleagues and classmates, less stigma, all sorts of positive changes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, so we've talked about the problem, this communication gap around menstrual discomfort. Let's dive into their solution, the EMS system. Can you break down how that works? Like, for someone who's never heard of EMS before, how does electrical muscle stimulation actually work to simulate something like menstrual cramps?
Okay, so basically, EMS uses electrical impulses to cause muscles to contract, like when you get a little shock and your muscle twitches. It's kind of like that, but controlled and targeted.
Oh, okay, I see.
So in this case, they're applying these electrical impulses to the abdominal muscles. The idea is that by inducing contractions in those muscles, they can mimic the pain that people experience during menstrual cramps, which are caused by the uterus contracting.
So it's like they're kind of tricking the body into feeling something similar to what happens during actual cramps, even though it's coming from a different source.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And the hope is that this simulated experience can give people a much more concrete understanding of what those cramps feel like.
Interesting. And the goal is for users to actually feel this happening in their own bodies as they go about their day,
Yeah.
right? Like not just in a lab setting, but out in the real world.
That's the idea, yeah.
And the thought is that for men, it would give them this more, I don't know, visceral understanding of what it's actually like to deal with menstrual cramps. And for women, it could be a way to like compare the simulated pain to their own experiences and maybe even communicate about it more effectively.
Right. It's like, instead of just trying to describe the pain with words, you can actually say, hey, remember that thing we tried with the EMS? It's kind of like that.
Oh, that's clever. It creates a shared point of reference, almost like a universal language for talking about this.
Exactly. And I think that's what the researchers are really aiming for, to move away from this idea that menstruation is somehow inexpressible and make it something that we can talk about and understand in a more concrete way.
Yeah, that's a really cool goal. Okay, before we dive into the actual experiments they did, you mentioned that the paper looks at some related work in this area too. Can you tell us a bit more about that? Like what kind of similar projects have been done?
Sure. So they talk about some projects that have used VR to help people understand different perspectives. Like there's one called Childhood that simulated the physical limitations experienced by children. So you could actually experience what it's like to be, shorter or have less strength.
Oh, wow, that's interesting.
Right. And there's another one called Mommy Tummy that simulated the physical burdens of pregnancy. So you could wear this vest that made your belly heavier and shifted your center of gravity and all that.
So these are all about using technology to build empathy, to help people understand what it's like to be in someone else's shoes, literally.
Exactly. And I think that's really what's exciting about this whole field. And they also talk about another project that's specifically focused on menstruation, which is called the menstrual machine.
Okay, the menstrual machine. That sounds intense. What was that all about?
So it was actually a device that was created back in the 70s, I think, and it aimed to simulate menstruation, but it was pretty different from what these researchers are doing.
How so?
Well, the menstrual machine actually incorporated a system to mimic bleeding, and it used electrical stimulation, but in a much more general way. It wasn't focused on accurately recreating the specific pain sensations.
So it was more about the overall experience, not the specific pain.
Right. And that's one of the key differences between this earlier work and what these researchers are doing. This current research is specifically trying to quantify and recreate the pain itself based on how people actually describe their menstrual cramps. It's a much more targeted approach.
That makes sense. So they're not just trying to evoke a general feeling of discomfort or simulate the physical act of bleeding, but they're actually trying to recreate the specific sensations of pain as closely as possible.
Exactly. They want to make it as realistic as possible so that people can have a truly accurate understanding of what it's like.
Okay, cool. Now let's talk a bit more about the actual experience of pain. The paper goes into some detail about different types of pain, which I thought was really interesting. Why is this important? Like, why do we need to understand these distinctions when we're talking about simulating something like menstrual cramps?
Oh, that's a great question. It's important because not all pain is created equal, right? Like if you stub your toe, it hurts differently than if you have a headache. And understanding these different types of pain helps us assess how effectively EMS can actually replicate the specific sensations of menstrual cramps.
I see. Okay.
So the paper talks about this distinction between somatic pain, which is pain that originates in the skin or muscles, and visceral pain, which comes from internal organs.
So like a stomach ache would be visceral pain.
Yeah, exactly. And menstrual cramps are also classified as visceral pain because they originate in the uterus.
Okay, got it. So the challenge is to use a technology that's primarily affecting the muscles, which would be somatic pain, to simulate a pain that's actually coming from an internal organ.
Right. It's about trying to bridge that gap between those two types of pain experiences.
And what are the typical characteristics of menstrual cramps? How would you describe that pain?
So most people describe it as a dull pain, which is a
Yeah.
really important characteristic that the researchers were trying to reproduce using EMS.
Okay, dull pain. So how does EMS, which is working on the muscles, create that dull, visceral kind of pain? That seems like a key thing to understand.
Yeah, so the way EMS works is by causing muscles to contract, right? And when you have a really strong muscle contraction, it can actually compress the blood vessels in that area.
Oh, interesting. So it's like cutting off the blood supply a little bit?
Kinda, yeah. It's called muscle ischemia. And that reduction in blood flow can cause a buildup of certain substances in the muscle that actually trigger pain receptors. And the type of pain that you typically feel from this kind of muscle ischemia is a dull ache.
So their hypothesis was that even though the origin of the pain is different, it's coming from the abdominal muscles rather than the uterus. The actual sensation, that dull ache, could be very similar to what people experience during actual menstrual cramps.
Exactly. And that was what they set out to test.
Okay, that's fascinating. So how did they actually set up their experiment? What did this EMS-based menstrual experience system actually look like?
So in the initial experiments, the system was pretty simple. They had a control board, which was basically like a computer interface that allowed them to control the electrical stimulation.
Yeah.
And then they had an Arduino, which is like a tiny little computer that was actually generating the electrical pulses.
Okay,
And then, of course, they needed a power supply to provide the electricity.
of course.
And the actual stimulation was delivered through 2 electrode pads, which are like little sticky patches that you put on the skin.
Oh, like the ones you use for a 10S machine.
Yeah, exactly like that. And the researchers were really careful to control the intensity of the stimulation so they could adjust the voltage, which is basically the strength of the electrical signal, using software.
So they could make it stronger or weaker depending on what the participant could tolerate.
Exactly. And they also had some built-in safety features like protection against excessive current and a way for the participants to immediately stop the stimulation if it got too uncomfortable.
Right. Safety first.
Yeah.
So where did they actually put these electrode pads on the participants?
So the placement was very specific. They wanted to target a particular muscle in the abdomen called the lower rectus abdominis.
Okay.
And to find that muscle, they had the participants tighten their abdominal muscles, and then a female researcher would actually palpate their abdomen, which basically means feeling around with their fingers to locate the exact position of that muscle.
So it was a very hands-on approach to make sure they were hitting the right spot.
Yeah, exactly, because everyone's anatomy is a little bit different, so they wanted to make sure they were targeting the correct muscle for each participant.
Makes sense.
And once they found the right spot, they would attach the 2 electrode pads to the lower part of the rectus abdominis, positioned symmetrically with the navel in the middle.
Yeah.
And they used wet tissue between the pads and the skin to help reduce skin resistance, which can affect how deeply the electrical signals penetrate.
So like to make sure the stimulation was getting to the muscle and not just staying on the surface.
Exactly. And then they used an elastic belt to hold the pads securely in place.
Okay, cool. So they've got the pads in place. They can control the intensity of the stimulation, and they actually experimented with different patterns of electrical stimulation too, right? You mentioned wave 1, wave 2, and wave 3 earlier. What was that all about?
Yeah, so they used 3 different types of stimulation patterns, which basically varied how quickly the voltage changed over time. So you can think of it like waves at the beach, right? Like some waves come in really slow and gentle, while others are much faster and choppier.
Okay, yeah, I get it.
So wave 1 was like a slow, gradual increase and decrease in voltage, kind of like a gentle swell. Wave 2 was a bit faster with a quicker rise and fall. And wave 3 was a sine wave, which means the rate of voltage change wasn't constant. It started slow, got faster in the middle, and then slowed down again.
So it's like the intensity was fluctuating throughout the stimulation.
Exactly. And they wanted to see if these different patterns of stimulation would affect how the pain felt. like if one felt more similar to natural cramps than the other.
Oh, that's interesting. Like maybe one pattern would create that dull ache more
Yeah.
effectively than the others.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so they're testing out these different waveforms. They're carefully controlling the intensity. What did they actually find? Like, what were the key takeaways from these experiments?
Okay, so first of all, they found that the average pain level that participants reported for their typical menstrual cramps was around 4.97 on an 11-point scale.
Okay, so kind of in the middle, but still pretty significant.
Right. And one of the things that was interesting was that one of the participants actually said that she was unaware of how painful my menstrual cramps were until she was asked to rate them on a scale,
Oh, wow.
which I thought was really telling because it highlights how, we often just kind of push through the pain and don't really think about how intense it actually is.
Yeah, no, it's like you just get used to it and normalize it.
Totally.
Okay, so that's interesting. What about the connection between how much pain they usually experienced and how much EMS they could handle?
Right, so they actually found a weak positive correlation there, which basically means that the people who usually had more severe cramps tended to be able to tolerate a slightly higher level of EMS stimulation.
Okay, so there was a link, but it wasn't super strong.
Right. But the more important finding was that the pain produced by all three EMS waveforms was actually comparable in intensity to the participants' usual menstrual cramps, both for the people who reported low pain and high pain. So in terms of the strength of the pain, the EMS was able to match what they usually experienced.
Okay, so they were able to recreate the intensity of the pain pretty accurately. That's encouraging.
Huh.
But you mentioned earlier that there was a significant difference in terms of where the pain was felt.
Yes, exactly. This was a really important finding. So while the EMS was able to match the intensity of the pain, the participants consistently reported that the EMS pain felt much more superficial, like closer to the surface of the skin compared to their natural cramps, which they described as feeling much deeper, more internal.
Oh, so even if it hurt about the same amount, it didn't feel like it was coming from the right place.
Exactly. And this difference in location actually had a significant impact on how similar the EMS experience felt to their actual cramps overall.
I see.
On average, the perceived similarity was only around 50%.
Oh, wow. So even though the intensity was there, that difference in location really threw things off.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that they found that the location of the pain was actually more strongly correlated with the perceived similarity to menstrual cramps than the intensity of the pain.
So even if the EMS hurt the exact same amount as their cramps, if it didn't feel like it was coming from the right place,
Yeah.
it wasn't convincing.
Right. So that location was really key. And it makes sense, right? Like if you're trying to simulate a specific pain experience, it needs to feel like it's coming from the right place in the body.
Yeah, totally. If it feels like it's coming from your skin, but your cramps usually feel like they're deep inside, it's just not going to be the same.
Exactly. What about the description of the pain? Did that dull pain descriptor come up for both?
Oh, yeah. They found that the dull pain description was common to both the natural menstrual cramps and the EMS sensations, which again supports their initial idea that EMS could be a good way to recreate this key characteristic of menstrual pain.
Cool. So they were able to recreate the dullness, but there were still some key differences. Participants noted that the EMS lacked the kind of like ebb and flow, the intense variations and longer duration of really strong contraction that they experienced with their natural cramps.
Oh, so it was missing some of the nuance, the more subtle changes in sensation over time.
Yeah, exactly. Like with natural cramps, the pain might build gradually, then peak really intensely, then subside a bit, then come back again. And the EMS wasn't really able to capture that dynamic aspect.
Got it. So while the overall quality of the pain was similar, it was missing some of that complexity.
Right. And a big part of that was that pesky electrical sensation on the skin that we talked about earlier. The researchers identified that as a major issue.
Right, because it was making the pain feel too superficial.
Yeah, exactly. It was kind of like this extra layer of sensation that was interfering with their ability to really perceive that deeper, dull muscle ache. Some people even describe the EMS pain as feeling pricking or penetrating, which is definitely not how most people would describe their menstrual cramps.
Right. And they talked about this thing called skin impedance too, right?
Oh, yeah, that's basically the skin's natural resistance to electrical signals.
So like some people's skin might block the signals more than others.
Exactly. And that can make it harder for the EMS to really get down to the muscle and create that deep sensation they're looking for.
I see. So it sounds like even though they were able to get the intensity and the dullness right, there were still some key differences that need to be addressed. It's not quite a perfect simulation yet.
Right. It's definitely still a work in progress, but it's a really promising start.
Absolutely. And the paper talks about how they took this technology beyond just the lab and actually used it in exhibitions too, right?
Yeah, which is super cool. So for the exhibitions, they actually expanded the system to create a more like immersive menstrual experience.
Oh, wow. What did they add?
So first of all, they added heated Peltier devices, which were worn on the inner thighs to simulate the sensation of menstrual bleeding.
Okay, so now they're adding temperature into the mix.
Yeah, to make it feel even more realistic.
Yeah.
And then they also added this posture detection sensor, which would actually influence the EMS stimulation depending on whether the user was standing, sitting, or moving around.
Wow, so they're incorporating movement and posture now too. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to create this whole body experience that really captures the nuances of what it's like to have a period. And the idea with the posture sensor was to kind of mimic that like hyper awareness that you can sometimes have when you're on your period, where you're constantly adjusting how you're sitting or standing to try to minimize discomfort.
Right, like, oh, if I sit this way, it hurts more, that kind of thing.
Exactly. So they wanted to incorporate that element of like behavioral adaptation into the experience.
That's really clever. So in these exhibitions, people were experiencing the cramp-like pain from the EMS, the sensation of bleeding from the heated devices, and even this feeling of being mindful of their posture. It's like a full-body simulation.
Yeah, pretty much. And the way they set up the exhibitions was really interesting too. They had this whole structured experience where participants would first get an explanation of what the system was all about, give their consent, and fill out a questionnaire.
Okay, standard procedure.
Then they would get the devices attached, and the researchers would adjust the intensity of the EMS to a level that was comfortable but still noticeable for each individual.
So it was personalized to make sure it wasn't too overwhelming for anyone.
Exactly. And then they would have the participants experience the simulated symptoms in different scenarios, like standing, sitting, and even imagining themselves on a crowded train to see how those different situations might affect the perception of the sensations. And then afterward, they would fill out another questionnaire to share their reactions and feedback.
So they were really trying to gather data on how people experienced this whole thing. What kind of feedback did they get? Like, what did people who participated in these exhibitions, both women and men, actually say about it?
It was really fascinating. The women generally found the experience surprisingly realistic, and many of them were actually surprised by how similar it felt to their own periods. Some even said that the EMS cramps felt stronger than what they typically experience, which really shows how much variation there is in how people experience these symptoms.
Right. It emphasizes that individual experience again. Right.
Totally. And then the men, they were often really surprised by how long the symptoms could potentially last. I think a lot of them just don't realize that this is something that people can deal with for days on end. And a lot of them reported feeling a lot more empathy after going through the experience.
Oh, that's great. So it actually had an impact on their understanding and their empathy levels.
Yeah, and some of them even said that they would be more likely to offer their seat on public transport to someone who looked like they might be experiencing menstrual discomfort.
Wow. So it actually changed their behavior, their willingness to be helpful and supportive. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah, it is. And I think it really speaks to the potential of this kind of technology to not just raise awareness, but actually change people's attitudes and actions.
No, that's really cool. It's not just about understanding. It's about translating that understanding into action.
Exactly.
Okay, so overall, it sounds like the exhibitions were pretty successful in terms of helping people understand and communicate about menstrual cramps.
Yeah, definitely. The researchers concluded that the experience was really effective in helping people articulate the sensations of menstrual cramps, improving understanding, and even starting conversations about individual differences. It created this shared experience that really facilitated communication and empathy.
That's fantastic. But they also acknowledge that this is still early stage research, right? Like,
Yeah.
there are still some kinks to work out.
Oh, absolutely. They're very upfront about the limitations of the current system.
Yeah. What are some of the main ones?
So one thing they pointed out is that the order in which they presented the different EMS waveforms might have influenced how participants perceived them.
Oh, like if you try the gentle wave first, then the intense wave, it might feel more intense than if you try them in the opposite order.
Exactly, and that's something they need to control for in future studies. And they also acknowledge that the maximum intensity of the EMS might not have been strong enough for some people, particularly those who experience really severe cramps. So they need to figure out a way to make the stimulation even stronger while still keeping it safe.
Yeah, you don't want to be causing anyone any harm.
Right. And another limitation is that they were really focusing on pain intensity in the study, and they didn't really account for all the other symptoms that people can experience with their periods, like back pain, bloating, headaches, all that stuff.
Oh, right. It's not just about the cramps.
Exactly. So they need to figure out a way to incorporate those other symptoms into the simulation if they really want to create a truly comprehensive experience.
Makes sense.
And then finally, they talked about the challenge of making sure the electrode pads are placed in exactly the right spot on everyone. Because everyone's anatomy is a little bit different, it can be tricky to make sure the stimulation is hitting the right muscle every time.
Right. And that could affect how the pain is perceived, too.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's definitely still work to be done. But overall, it sounds like this research is really pushing the boundaries of how we think about and understand menstrual discomfort.
Totally. It's a really fascinating first step toward using technology to bridge the communication gap around this experience. And while the current system definitely has limitations, the fact that it was able to generate so much empathy and conversation in the exhibition setting is super promising.
It's like it's opening up a whole new way of talking about and understanding this, which could have huge implications for everything from personal relationships to healthcare to public policy.
Yeah, exactly. It's pretty exciting to think about where this could go.
Totally. So here's a final thought for our listeners to chew on. Imagine if we could experience, even just a little bit, what it's like to be in someone else's body, to feel what they feel, to really understand what they're going through on a physical level. How would that change our interactions? How would it affect our empathy and our willingness to support each other? And think about this. It doesn't just have to be about menstrual discomfort. What other experiences, like chronic pain conditions or sensory sensitivities, could benefit from this kind of technological approach to fostering empathy? It really makes you wonder what the future holds for this kind of technology and what it could mean for our understanding of the human experience.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and it's something I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of.
For sure. It's definitely a space to watch. And it sounds like these researchers are going to keep pushing the boundaries and working to refine this technology, which is awesome.
Yeah, can't wait to see what they come up with next.
Me neither. Thanks for breaking this all down for us.
Anytime. This was fun.
Catch you next time.